And let me first acknowledge our sponsor, Beltetz, that has generously provided some financial support, although our speakers volunteer, obviously. Let me also thank Sean Driscoll, again, operating the computer so that we can greet.
You can hold your applause to the end. We'll see if it goes off.
My name is Joe Steinfeld, and I am the moderator of the program. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers, and then we will hear first from Martha and then from Jeff, both of whom are pioneers. Martha Crocker is from the North Country, Gorham, but has the distinction of being the first woman lawyer in Cheshire County. She graduated from Franklin Pierce Law School, practiced law, and then, I think this has something to do with meeting Jeff, came to Cheshire County. She then became a member of the county attorney's office, where she handled cases for several years. Governor Sununu, that's the former Governor Sununu, appointed her to the State District Court, where she served for 33 years, largely in Milford, but those judges circulated. And she retired 3 years ago, just in time for the pandemic, which is actually pretty good timing given the problems the courts have been facing. So she is a legal pioneer. Jeff Crocker, and I know that many of you here and online know the Crockers, but maybe a few of you do not. Jeff is also a lawyer, practiced here in Jaffrey for many years, and more recently in Peterborough at the Upton Hatfield firm, and specializing in estate planning, elder law, and real estate. But beyond the practice of law, Jeff has been, like Martha, an incredibly involved citizen. He was named Jaffrey's Man of the Year in 2019, and over the years has been on the board or committees of New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, the Peterborough Planning Board, the Monadnock Community Hospital, and not incidentally served for many years as the chair of the New Hampshire Jewish Federation, excuse me. So his pioneering, in a sense, is perhaps involuntary as a member of the first Jewish family in the town of Jaffrey. And we'll hear something about his experiences. But first, it's a pleasure to introduce Martha Croft.
Is it all right if I take my mask off?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you all for having me. In 1980, I married my law school sweetheart and moved to Jaffrey. Even though I was only 1 year out of law school and having no experience with criminal law or trial practice, Ed O'Brien, better known as Skitsy, hired me as the full-time assistant county attorney. Back then, the county attorney was part-time and was elected. Part-time county attorneys were able to continue to practice, have a private practice of law, as well as being the chief law enforcement officer in the county, prosecuting all of the Superior Court level felonies and misdemeanor and violation appeals out of the district courts, as well as conducting periodic grand juries. My first several weeks were spent getting familiar with files, understanding the process and procedure, and following Skitsy. As we were told in law school, no one learns how to be a trial lawyer out of a book, but rather by observing in the first instance, and then learning by doing. Skitsy was a good man and a good teacher. After a few weeks of going through case files, we attended the opening of court, an interesting tradition that occurred on the first day of the fall session of the Cheshire County Superior Court. The presiding justice was seated, and the High Sheriff, Kenny Lysette, with great pomp and circumstance, and he was a big man, formally announced the opening of court. Oyez, oyez, the Superior Court of Cheshire County is now sitting. All those having cases before this honorable court, come forth and ye shall be heard. Most, if not all, the practicing attorneys in the county were in attendance. And for the first time, I realized that the Cheshire County Bar was all men. In other words, all wingtips and one pair of high heels. Reflecting back, with only a few exceptions, which I will discuss later, I was always treated with the utmost respect and courtesy by judges, attorneys, and police. And I didn't feel as if I was treated any differently than any other attorneys. Sometimes they treated me a little bit more politely. The group of attorneys who practice criminal law did, at first, proceed with caution, wondering, does she know anything? Not much, but I was a quick learner. And can she be trusted? And I knew it would take some time to build trust. I think that because there had been little interaction between male and female attorneys at this time, a general stereotype emerged. Lady lawyers had something to prove. They practiced law with a chip on their shoulder. Lady lawyers hadn't been around for very long. The first members of the New Hampshire Bar were sworn in 1686. There were 3, all men. It wasn't until 1890, 204 years later, that the first woman, Marilla Ricker, applied to take the New Hampshire Bar and was denied. She petitioned the Supreme Court, which ruled women were not prevented from being attorneys at common law. During the 87 years between 1890 and 1977, only 100 women were admitted to the practice of law in New Hampshire. One of my first forays into court, totally on my own, was a negotiated plea. I was totally prepared. I couldn't mess this up. Probation report and recommended sentence had all been fully negotiated with counsel and accepted by the defendant. I knew the case, I gave my offer of proof and the state's recommendation for sentencing, which was confirmed by defense counsel and the defendant. The judge, however, then went back and forth a couple of times asking the defense, are you sure? Did you have full discovery? Is this acceptable to your client? I was thinking, am I going to lose a negotiated plea? But the judge accepted the plea, and that ended my first day in court by myself. Later that day, I learned that when the judge left the bench, he went back into chambers where he was having a chambers conference with 2 other attorneys on a civil matter. He walked in grumbling that he had just had a plea with a prosecutor who sold defense counsel on a very stiff sentence. She's a tough lady. The older attorney nodded his head with a grin, pointed to the attorney to his right, stating, Judge, this man knows exactly what you mean. The other attorney was Jeff Crocker. Skitsy did most of the felonies during the first year. I always sat second chair, learning through observation and doing the back office work of prepping cases. During this time, the Superior Court also heard appeals from district and municipal courts. Misdemeanor appeals had to be scheduled for jury trials. Violation cases were tried before a judge. I tried some of the misdemeanors and all of the violations. We did not have many misdemeanor appeals, but voluminous numbers of violation appeals. It was well known that there was a district court judge, not Bernie, who, having found defendants guilty after trial, would tell them that if they went across the street to the Superior Court, they might get a better deal. Needless to say, I was not disappointed when violations were no longer appealable to the Superior Court. One of the responsibilities that I enjoyed the most was grand jury. The grand jury would meet monthly to review cases. You may have heard the saying that a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich if that's what you wanted. I was determined that there would be no ham sandwich indictments in Cheshire County. The grand jury process for me started with a review of the complete case file to determine if there was any aspect that required further investigation, clarification, and ultimately whether a case, although classified as a felony, would be better handled in the district court as a misdemeanor or even a violation. This did not happen frequently, the exception being mainly for the possession of minor amounts of marijuana. This was where I got the most pushback from the police. Back then, possession of a small amount of marijuana could be a felony. The police reports tended to follow the same path. The officer stops the car for speed, taillight out, yellow line violation, anything like that. The officer scans the interior of the car with his flashlight, and I'm going to use the pronoun his or him because all the police were male, and would see a roach in the open ashtray. And having seen the roach in plain view, that gave him the authority to search the rest of the car. Sometimes the roach was all there was, and sometimes after the search, a small amount of marijuana was found, usually in the console beside the driver. Most of these defendants were young. Their brains had not yet been developed to the point where they should have realized that if you were going to have any interaction with the police, it's probably in a car. And secondly, it's never a good idea to keep any kind of contraband out where anyone else can see it. But it's a scientific fact that the synapses which connect the various parts of the brain to the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that governs planning and judgment, are not fully formed until the individual attains the age of 24 or 25. So for those of you who may wonder why your teens or 20-somethings acted the way they did, answer: immature brain completion. Even after trial and conviction for small amounts of marijuana, I knew I couldn't get more than a fine and a probable stern rebuke from the judge for wasting the court's time and state resources. Felonies are serious offenses which carry substantial state prison penalties and stigma. A felony conviction could be life-altering and not in a good way. Most of the police understood that some cases which could have been brought as a felony would be better handled on the district court level and would charge accordingly. The exception was one overly aggressive detective sergeant in the largest police department, which of course produced the largest number of cases. He would call every time I returned a case. He was rude, disrespectful, and wasn't at all accepting of my decisions. He tried going over my head to Skitsy, who refused to overrule me, and the detective called again and again. The last time he called, with his usual diatribe, I'd had enough, but wouldn't give him the satisfaction of hanging up on him. I interrupted, got his attention, and told him that I had heard enough, so he could continue and hang up when he was finished. But I was putting the receiver in the trash and lightly banged it against the side of the trash can. I think he finally accepted that I could not be bullied. To ensure no ham sandwich indictments, I established some rules for processing grand jury work. All police reports, including any search warrants and arrest warrants, had to be in our office no later than 1 week before the convening of the grand jury. Previously, officers would walk in anytime up to the day of grand jury and with their reports in hand. This created a panoply of problems, including poorly drafted indictments, missing information in the file, or gaps in the investigation. The police file had to cover evidence supporting each element of the criminal offense charged. The role of the grand jury was to determine whether the state had sufficient evidence to establish that there was probable cause to believe that the criminal offense charged had been committed by the named defendant. But there is a huge gap between probable cause to indict and proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which was the state's burden at trial. Only the state gets to present evidence at the grand jury, ergo, the ham sandwich. The grand jury was given the actual indictment, the elements of the offense were explained, and the main investigating officers testified as to the facts. The grand jury was a great tool in obtaining a sense from lay people of the strength or weaknesses of a case. They did their job well. As in everything, however, stuff happens. And we would occasionally get a police file within 5 days, within the 5-day window. And we would accommodate, provided if the officer came in with a heartfelt mea culpa, except for one incident. 2 days before the grand jury, a state trooper called indicating that he had not received a subpoena to appear for his case. He told me he hand-delivered the file well over a week ago. I told him we had no file from him. And he said, oh, we must have mislaid it or lost it. I had established a paper flow system. Files were not mislaid nor lost. I told him to bring a copy and I'd take a look at it. I knew that all state police reports had to be countersigned by the lieutenant before submission. The lieutenant had dated and signed off on this report that very morning. The trooper committed the greatest sin. He had lied and fabricated a story. And if he could do that, how could I have any faith in anything he brought to me or presented to a jury? I refused to present the case. Sometimes the bad guys go free. When the lieutenant called inquiring as to why, I flat out refused to present the trooper's case because it was late. I explained, and thankfully, I never saw a case from this trooper again. In general, the police officers were a good, hardworking, honest group of men. They understood that when we worked together as a team, we could get the job done. I was always available to answer legal and strategic questions, which the police took full advantage of. Being a prosecutor carries with it a large component of education, not only advising the police as to how, but why. In one instance, a sergeant approached me for advice on a very sensitive matter. The police chief was stealing gas from the town pumps. The chief, becoming concerned that someone might see him, ordered the sergeant to assign 2 officers to stand by to keep an eye out to see if anybody was coming by. This would make the officers accomplices to the chief's thefts. Just as the driver of a getaway car in a bank robbery is as legally chargeable as the robbers who entered the bank. We arranged for state police to stake out the area for several mornings. They returned the report to me, to my office, and totally bypassing the local police department. We sent the reports to the town selectmen. The chief resigned and moved on to selling used cars in Massachusetts. As anyone who has ever been a juror or witnessed a trial, I think you would agree that watching a trial is pretty boring. There is rarely the aha moment of a Perry Mason trial, and trials do not always run like clockwork. As we all know, there are cases, all cases are not equal. There are those cases that are very strong, a probable slam dunk. There are those that have significant weaknesses, a possible, probable loss. Even cases believed to be slam dunks sometimes took unexpected turns. In a receiving stolen property case, a late model vehicle was stolen in Massachusetts, driven to New Hampshire where the cowl and the vehicle identification numbers were removed and the vehicle readied for delivery to the intended purchaser. This was all accomplished within 24 hours. The police and the sheriffs, pursuant to a lengthy investigation and armed with a search warrant, raided the chop shop and took possession of the vehicle. Upon further investigation of the vehicle, several of the hidden vehicle identification numbers were uncovered, thereby establishing that the vehicle they had in custody, so to speak, was the same vehicle stolen from Massachusetts. All of the pieces were connected. The vehicle, as evidence, was stored at a local garage under lock and key. The morning, as we were preparing to go up to the courtroom to commence the trial, we received a phone call. Someone had broken into the garage and stolen the car. The stolen car was stolen again. Our evidence was gone, as was our case. Another incident involved the same defendant, but this time with a different Massachusetts vehicle. The owner of the vehicle had been fully cooperated with the Massachusetts authorities, the New Hampshire authorities, the insurance company investigators, and our office. Again, all set for trial. The owner of the vehicle was the only person who could testify that he had not given anyone permission to take the car. But he was not to be found. We had the vehicle this time, but we didn't have the owner. Rumor had it that he took an extended vacation with the insurance money. And then there was the time that in the middle of trial, the court broke for lunch and the defendant was free on bail, left and didn't return. I had to scramble. And I'd never done this before, so this was really flying, not well prepared. That we had witnesses who had yet to testify, and part of their testimony required them to identify the defendant, thereby connecting their testimony to the defendant who was no longer sitting at defense table. In order to complete the trial and try the defendant in absentia, we had to procure a photograph of the defendant and a person who was in the courtroom during the trial to testify that the defendant who had been at defense table was the identical person shown in the photograph. So having completed that preliminary step, each of the remaining witnesses was able to identify the defendant from the photograph, and we completed the rest of the trial with the defendant absent. I did have my one and only Perry Mason aha moment. I don't remember what the offense was, but the defense was relying on an alibi witness. In other words, the defendant could not have possibly committed the offense because he was with someone else far away from the scene of the crime. I completed the state's case and rested. The court took a recess, after which the defense was going to present their case. During the recess, the defense alibi witness asked to speak with me. He told me he didn't know what to do and didn't want to get into trouble for lying. I moved to reopen my case and put him on as a state's witness, who testified that the defendant had forced him into providing an alibi, which just was not true. I really wanted to ask more questions and relish in my aha moment. But I remembered the words of a great trial attorney who said, after the answer to your question blows the opposing side's case apart, don't dwell, sit down. I sat down. With the alibi witness gone, the defense had no witnesses and rested. Interaction with judges was always formal, courteous, and respectful, with one very unfortunate exception. I was trying a simple theft case, a one-day trial, slam dunk. The defendant was an attractive young lady. The case went in as anticipated. The defense finished their case, choosing not to call the defendant. The case was submitted to the jury, who came back quickly, which is always a good sign, almost always a good sign for the prosecution. The verdict was guilty. The jury was dismissed, and then the judge announced that he was entering a verdict NOV, in that he was going to vacate the jury's verdict and enter a verdict of not guilty in its place, as no reasonable jury could have possibly reached a guilty verdict. I was dumbfounded. I walked out of the courtroom with defense counsel and asked, what the hell just happened? The answer was, you saw the defendant, and did you notice how the judge was smiling at her during the trial? Had she not been attractive, or had she been a male, I would have pled this case out in a minute. This attorney knew more about the judge than I did. Unfortunately, this judge's session in Cheshire County had not yet come to an end. And I had a very sensitive sexual assault case involving a 4-year-old boy. Because of the boy's age, now 5, there were preliminary issues of competency. I got a phone call from the clerk's office indicating that the judge wanted to see me in chambers on this case. When I arrived, I found the defense counsel was not present. It is highly improper for a judge to have an ex parte, a one-sided conversation on a case. I raised the question as to the absence of defense counsel. The judge was abrupt, cutting me off, and speaking in a demeaning tone. He went on to discuss the case, knowing virtually nothing about the case, setting a bright line that no 5-year-old is competent to testify. And he refused to let me generally put forth that which I believed the child could testify to. I knew, however, that there were major issues putting a 5-year-old on the witness stand. But this wasn't going to be a discussion. The judge stated he doubted the assault ever happened and was made up by the boy or coached by someone. And if it happened, he probably enjoyed it. I was in, I was in total disbelief. I felt a little like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. There were so many ethical violations and inappropriate comments and conclusions. Later that afternoon, I got a second phone call from the clerk's office, summoning me to chambers. I had to go. Again, no one else was present. The judge just wanted to warn me that if I ever brought that morning's discussion to light, that no one would ever believe me. A young assistant county attorney looking to make a name for herself versus a superior court judge with long-standing political contacts in high places. He would destroy me and see to it that I never practiced law again. He was probably right. No one would take my word over his denials. After discussing this whole thing with Jeff, I didn't think it was a battle that I could win, so I decided to do nothing. I did manage, however, to get the few things I had left on this docket moved to the following term. And as to the little boy, he was doing fine and was safe, and so much time had passed that his parents and I felt that it would be more emotionally harmful than beneficial to proceed with the case. So during those 5 years, I had only one regret, that I permitted a person of power to threaten, bully, and intimidate me. I don't think my decision was wrong. It was a different time then. And much has changed for the better during the past 40 years, Females are now well established as lawyers in all fields of law. They are judges on all levels of courts, Supreme, Superior, and now District Circuit. A lot for the better has occurred since Marilla Ricca first won the right to take the New Hampshire bar exam and enter the honorable field of law. To sum up, after leaving Keene, I was nominated to be a district court judge by Governor John Sununu. During my interview before the New Hampshire Bar, as they had a role in the vetting process, the Bar Association had received a letter of recommendation submitted by a long-standing Keene criminal defense attorney on my behalf. The letters were to be confidential, but the interviewers said that they were going to break confidentiality to share one sentence of this letter with me. The letter stated, "I never liked lady lawyers, and I still don't much like lady lawyers, but Martha is okay. She's like one of us."
Well, Jeff, you've got a hard act to follow. The word that occurs to me, Martha, about your talk is spellbinding. And I suspect everyone, and there are about 60 of us here in the room. And can we get the full screen of everybody who's participating? Thanks, Sean. And we have many of you looking in from home, and we welcome you to, I see Judge Ginsburg here, I think, and perhaps other judges. You weren't the first New Hampshire woman judge, but you were among the first.
I was the second.
Jean Burling was the first
Claremont was the first.
in the Claremont District Court and went on to the Superior Court. Well, those of you who are online should use the chat line to ask questions. I think what we will do is hold off the questions until after we hear from Jeff. It's a great pleasure, Jeff, to introduce you. Jeff Crocker.
That was amazing, Martha. Thank you for setting the bar so high for me.
I have to pay him to say that.
So I'm going to tell you a different story. My story about growing up in Jaffrey's first and what was at that time only Jewish family. If it goes well, please let me know. If it doesn't, Joe's the one that asked me to do this. To provide some context, I
should tell you that Martha's my lawyer.
I give up. To provide some context, I first want to offer a brief, and due to the constraints of time, superficial overview of the history of Jewish migration to this country. I think it will help. And specifically to our small southwest portion of New Hampshire. In doing so, though, I want to acknowledge and express my appreciation to the Historical Society of Cheshire County and its executive director, Alan Rumrand. In 2017, in connection with the 100th anniversary of Congregation Ahavas Achim in Keene, the synagogue in Keene, the Cheshire County Historical Society curated an exhibit titled "From Peddlers to Shopkeepers to Professionals, a History of the Jewish Community in Cheshire County." My family had the honor of sharing some of our family memorabilia displayed in that exhibit. And the Cheshire County Historical Society has graciously provided content from that exhibit, which I have incorporated into the first portion of this talk. And you'll see some pictures in a bit from the Historical Society. So just for some background, you should know that Jews began to immigrate to America in the 1650s, mainly from Spain and Portugal. They came in small numbers, and they were followed over the course of the next 100 years by Jews from other areas of Europe. They settled mostly along the Atlantic seaboard and several southern states. The environment that those immigrants found when they arrived was not very hospitable. During the 17th century, for example, Rhode Island was the only New England colony that allowed a permanent Jewish community. A second wave of immigration occurred and involved German Jews. Now, of course, Germany wasn't really a country yet. It started around the 1840s, and it was made up principally of principalities and little kingdoms in that area of the world. But all of those people had something in common. All of those Jews that came here were escaping some persecution, very restrictive laws. They couldn't practice many professions, so they lived in a lot of economic hardship there. During the 19th century, German Jews became the predominant Jewish cultural group in the United States, and they participated in the country's geographical expansion west. The third and largest wave of Jewish immigration took place between 1880 and 1924. 2.5 million Jews immigrated to the United States seeking freedom from extreme persecution. And Sean, if you want to, so here are some pictures from the Historical Society. The first 4 pictures or so, I think, will show you some examples of those people that came here at the turn of the 20th century. Most of these immigrants came from Russia and Poland. My ancestors came in this third wave of immigration, and this is where the Jewish community of Cheshire County entered the immigration story. Most of the Jews who came during this wave of immigration settled in large American cities. My maternal grandfather, for example, did that. But a small percentage settled in small communities such as Keene, and my paternal grandfather was in that group. Typical of these early Jewish Keene settlers was Hyman Cohen. He was one of the first Jews to arrive in Keene. He arrived in 1888, and he was only 16 years old, coming here from Lithuania at that time. Imagine what that was like for him. He was followed by a few other Jewish settlers during the late 1800s, and that initiated Keene's Jewish community. My maternal grandfather, I just want to mention him. His name was Dov Moshens. He was given the name David Morse by an immigration official when he arrived in Boston in the late 1890s. He built a large and successful business in Boston as a farrier. He was actually the master horseshoer of Boston. And his business was a great success until the horseless carriage of the Goodyear Tire Company put an end to it. David and his wife Bala had 9 children, of which my mother, Esther, was the youngest child. My paternal grandfather, Herschel Krakauer, emigrated to the United States from Russia, arriving in New York on December 15th, 1906. Sean, if you want to just move ahead, give us some more immigration pictures. There's a peddler in Westmoreland. This was part of the exhibit at the Historical Society. Look at that pack on his back. He's bent over with a walking stick. I think if you move ahead a little more, Sean, there's a Finkelstein's store. This is in Keene, Finkelstein's New York store. And then, so there's my grandfather, in Yiddish, my Zaidi, Herschel Krakauer, whose name was changed by an immigration official at Ellis Island to Harry Crocker. Harry's wife, her name was Yehudis in Yiddish, Julia was the name they gave her, and 2 infant children, Joe and Annie. So if we want to keep going, there's another picture of my grandfather. In these pictures, mind you, he's probably just a little younger than I am now. Look at that face of that man and imagine the difficult life that he led. Yeah. And this is his declaration of intention to become a citizen in 1949. So you see, he arrived December 15th of 1906 in his early 20s. He'd been born in 1883. And if you want to keep going, so here's a picture of of Julia and her eldest child, Joe, sitting up on a little table. That is my father. And the baby is my Aunt Annie. Yeah, we can keep that up for a minute. I love that picture. They stayed behind in Russia because Harry had to come here and earn some money in order to afford to bring them over. And they came over 2 years later in 1908. Harry saved up that money working in the scrap yards outside of Boston, Chelsea, Massachusetts. Once the rest of the family was here, they moved to Keene, at which time there was a growing community of immigrants from various parts of the world. Harry started his own business, peddling rags. In the 1909 Keene census, Harry's occupation was listed on the census records as junk collector. So he'd been in Keene for 1 year at that point. Over the course of many years, the business grew into a successful scrap metal company located in South Keene, where Cheshire Oil Company is now located. In 1916, Harry, together with other residents of the Keene Jewish community, founded a synagogue in Keene, Congregation Ahavas Achim, of which Harry was the third president. In addition to Joe and Annie, who were born in Russia, 4 more children were born to Harry and Julia in Keene. And if you flip ahead, maybe, yeah. So there's Harry with his favorite grandchild. If any of my cousins are watching this on Zoom, they may dispute my contention. They would be wrong. My father, Joe, a World War II veteran, became a naturalized citizen of the United States on February 12th, 1947. Okay. There's my dad, those of you who knew him and who remember him. There he was in his uniform. Yeah. And I think if you flip ahead, that is his certificate of naturalization in 1947, after World War II, after he fought for his country. He became a citizen at that time, having grown up in Keene. After the war, he worked as a salesman in Fitchburg, Boston. One of my father's accounts was a small corner market in Mattapan, Massachusetts, owned by my mother's sister, Helen, and her husband. Helen took a liking to my father and introduced him to Esther. They were married in 1950. Do we have that wedding? Yeah, there they are, their wedding, yeah, in Boston. Yeah, I love that picture too. About the same time, my father learned of a business opportunity in Jaffrey. The East Jaffrey Motor Garage on River Street was for sale. That is a clip from the Monadnock Breeze shortly after the 1936 flood. And if you read it closely, it says, if your car was damaged by the flood, you better have your plugs and points checked out. Yeah. So, you know, if you don't, most of you probably know where this building is. This is the building on the corner of Gilmore Pond Road and River Street, Route 202. I'm glad my father can't see it today. Joe thought it was a good location to open his own scrap metal business, having grown up in the business before the war. So 300 years after those first Jewish settlers arrived on this continent, Joe and Esther Crocker arrived in Jaffrey, New Hampshire to live and raise a family. My parents rented an apartment from John and Helene Hackler, who lived on Main Street. That building was strikingly familiar to me. That's where John and Helene lived. John owned Chrysler Plymouth garage on the corner down where Rite Aid is now. So the Hacklers lived there, and they had an apartment built over the garage at the rear of the building, and my parents rented it. They became very close friends, and that's where my parents lived from 1950 until about 1960. There was just one problem with my dad's business plan. He didn't have any money to start the thing, so he needed a loan. And he went to the Monadnock Bank. Now, at that time, the Monadnock Bank, there were really 2 banks. There was the Monadnock Savings Bank and the Monadnock National Bank. Still in the same location where TD Bank is now, but you'd walk in. The Savings Bank was on one side, the National Bank was on the other side. And he met with Warren Ruffle, who was a very dapper fellow, wore bow ties most of the time. And Don Proctor was a very nice man who was president of the bank for many years. If I recollect, Sean, correctly, I think you lived in the Ruffle.
I lived next door.
Or next door to the Ruffle.
The librarian was still there.
Evelyn.
Yeah.
She was the librarian. Ruffle's wife. She was very, very nice, very lovely. Although my father was new in town and had no money, he got the loan, and he remained forever grateful for the trust and confidence that Mr. Ruffalo and Mr. Proctor showed in him. They took a chance on him, something that wouldn't necessarily happen today. Joe operated that business until his passing at the age of 89. I think if you go more toward the end, if you fast forward, keep going, almost to the end. We'll come back to these. There he is. There he is later in life. That's that little boy sitting on the table. My parents developed many friendships in Jaffrey. There was the Main Street neighborhood. Del and Mary Del Rossi right across the street. They lived next door with their family. Dr. Moore, the dentist in town, and his wife Claire and their children, Cush and Griffin. Ann doesn't like to be reminded that she babysat for me once in a while. Francis and Regina Devlin were in the day pray house across the street. Mr. Devlin was a plumber in town, and they're boys. I joined the neighborhood when I was born on September 19th, 1953 at the Monadnock Community Hospital. And we continued to live, as I said, in that Main Street apartment until about 1960. David Del Rossi reminds me that, or at least recalls, how my father would drive the neighborhood kids to Silver Ranch for ice cream in the summertime, taking infant Jeff along for the ride. During these years, my mother joined and was an active member of the Jaffrey Women's Club, and my father's business was growing. My parents swiftly developed friendships with many other residents outside the neighborhood as well. To the best of my knowledge, my parents never encountered any prejudice whatsoever as they became immersed in this community. Each of my parents had grown up in communities, my mother in Boston and my father in Keene, in the midst of the great American melting pot, where many different immigrants mixed together, Jews, Italians, Irish, Greeks, and others. Developing and maintaining close relationships with people of different ethnic or religious backgrounds was nothing new for them. But what was new in Jaffrey was the complete absence of other Jewish people, almost. The downtown Abbott building. I mixed them up. Sean is doing great. The downtown Abbott building was owned by a Jewish family from Gardner, Massachusetts. They were descendants of Simon Abbott, for whom the building is named. The clothing store was on the right-hand side. The hardware store was on the left-hand side. The clothing store was run by Helen and her brothers, Jack and Isidore, ran the hardware store on the left-hand side. The Abbott brothers, Mr. Hackler, Father Frank from St. Pat's, and my father, I am told, would sometimes have a boys' night out, maybe at the horse track. I'm just telling, I've been told these things, I don't know. My parents' life in Jaffrey in the 1950s appeared to be extraordinarily typical, at least on the surface. My earliest memories go back to perhaps when I was 5 or 6. Following my parents' purchase of the home where I grew up on North Street, just a short distance behind this building. Go to the end of the street, down the hill, you're at my house. Well, what was my house? And I think those are back a couple more. There it is today, and there it was. That's how it was some years ago when the cedar trees were all there. Some of you remember how it looked then, and then the next picture, that is it today, where the McDonald's lived. My parents kept a completely kosher home. The term kosher refers to the strict dietary rules that must be observed to comply with traditional Jewish law. These rules define what a person is allowed to eat, how food is to be prepared, and what foods may be combined with other foods. The laws divide food into 3 main categories: meat, dairy, and what we call parav. Parav are foods that are neither meat nor dairy. So for example, fish, eggs, plants. Among the many rules, for example, meat and dairy may not be eaten together. In strict kosher kitchens, such as my parents', people use separate utensils, separate dishes, plates, pots, and pans for meat and dairy products so that they couldn't be mixed up. My mother had cabinets on one side of the kitchen for the meat products and on the other side of the kitchen for the dairy products. They could not be washed in the same water, lest they be contaminated. There were also, additional sets of these items for the week of Passover, things that would never come into contact with bread or grain products. To remain compliant with these rules, my parents had to purchase their meat from a kosher butcher. For meat to be considered kosher, a certified person known as a shochet needs to slaughter it in a specific manner. And there were certainly no kosher butchers in Jaffrey or surrounding communities. This meant making frequent trips to Boston or to Worcester to buy meat. For me, these trips were a bit of an ordeal. I was not happy about being dragged along. I would have been rather here at home playing with my friends. But it was a little tough on my parents too back in those days, you know, especially in a non-air conditioned car on a sweltering hot summer day making these trips. Eventually, my parents purchased a large chest freezer to store the kosher meat, so the trips became less frequent. Preparations for Passover in a kosher home are also quite involved. The kitchen drawers and cabinets that come into contact with bread or grain had to be completely emptied and thoroughly scrubbed, as did the oven, the stove, the sink, the refrigerator. Even the strainer in the sink had to be switched out for a Passover sink strainer. Preparing the home was Esther's job. She worked very hard to do that. It took a long time. I enjoyed the Passover Seders. Every year, my parents would make a special point to invite some non-Jewish friends to join us for at least one of the Seders. The Seder is a ritual feast, for those of you who do not know or haven't been to one. It's a ritual feast held in the home on the first 2 nights of the week of Passover. The story of the Exodus from Egypt is told, and then a multi-course dinner is served, following the dietary rules in force during the holiday week. There was a seminary where the Shattuck Golf Course is now located. If you don't know it, there was a seminary when I was growing up. And my parents became friendly with several young men who were brothers at the seminary. They were frequent visitors to our home, and they attended Passover Seder at our home several years. At the dinner table, they engaged in spirited discussions with my father, comparing and contrasting Catholicism and Judaism. Those discussions provided an example for me at an early age of how people from differing backgrounds can find common ground and foster respect for one another's differing beliefs. My father prayed in the traditional Jewish manner every morning. He wore his prayer shawl, a tallis, and his tefillin, or phylacteries, which are a set of small black leather boxes with leather straps attached to them, containing scrolls of parchment inscribed with verses from the Hebrew Bible. One is worn on your left arm to be close to your heart, the other on your head to be close to your mind. Observant Jews wear tefillin when they pray in the morning, on weekday mornings. My father, and back in the day, it was men who wore them, but now, nowadays, some modern Orthodox women wear them. My father enjoyed telling the following story. One morning while praying, he noticed and heard an aggressive dog chasing a small animal or a cat outside. And he ran outside while still wearing his tallis and tefillin to shoo the dog away. Later that day, one of our neighbors, who was always interested in learning about Jewish customs, asked him about the ritual significance of running around outside the house during morning prayers. I understood that I belonged to a family that lived by a different set of rules from the families in which my friends lived. As a child, I observed Christmas everywhere I went. It was all around me, except in my home. I recall the day that Santa came to visit my kindergarten class at the Baptist church. The Baptist church is where the post office is now, and that's where we had kindergarten. These were the years before Sandbox, before Mrs. Wheeler and Mrs. Hampstead. And I think we have a picture of, yeah, keep going. No, the other way, it's the other way. Keep going. There. So Mrs. Darling is on my mother's right, your left. Mrs. Christian is on the other side, and my mother is in the middle, and that was taken outside the Baptist church up there. They were very nice. So Mrs. Darling and Mrs. Christian drew the curtain shut and said, we couldn't look out the windows because Santa was coming today. You can't look out the windows. All the other children were quite excited, but I already sensed that Santa was not real and that the curtains were being drawn because they didn't want us to see Santa drive up in his car. Nevertheless, during Christmas, I implored my parents to hang a stocking from the mantle in our dining room. They did, and on Christmas morning, there appeared some gifts. Although I received presents for Hanukkah too, my folks did not want me to feel left out at Christmas. I recall that my Catholic friends had religious school, catechism, they called it. They had catechism after school, after secular school some days, and in the summer, for the first couple of weeks of summer vacation too. They weren't available for playing until they got out of catechism. One day, one of my friends came after catechism, said to me that his parents had said at home that I should be going to catechism. That bothered me and quite a lot. And I couldn't understand, why would someone think that I should be going to catechism? And looking back on it, quite frankly, I think I understand, or did understand at the most elementary level, that there's something about that statement that incorporated a pejorative concept, namely that there was something wrong with me or with my Jewishness that needed to be fixed or corrected. In the third grade, I had a very wonderful teacher. The class was assigned 10 spelling words to learn, all having to do with Christmas. This was around the holidays. And there would be a quiz at the end of the week. No problem, I thought. I was a pretty good speller. But then I was informed that I would be given a different list of words, all of which would have to do with Hanukkah or some other aspect of Judaism. Why did I have to be given a different list? Why couldn't we all work off one list that had both sets of words? I didn't study for the quiz. I got them all wrong. My mother was humiliated. Put aside for the moment the fact that all of these words are Hebrew words, and these were transliterations, not proper spellings. This experience, instead of inculcating pride in my heritage, had the effect really of making me feel quite separate from my classmates, a feeling I did not like. Although their intentions were good, my teacher and my parents had not yet figured out that if my friends could learn something about Hanukkah, and if I could learn something about Christmas, we could all learn something about each other that would create connections and be enriching. Remember, back at that time, not even a decade had passed since the separate but equal ruling in Brown v. Board, right? Fully sinking in what that means. You may wonder whether we belong to a synagogue. Well, my grandfather, Harry, as you recall, was a founder and active member of the Keene Synagogue. As was the case with most Eastern European Jewish immigrants of that time period, Harry was an Orthodox Jew. This meant that he followed very traditional Jewish ritual and religious practices, one of which was that in synagogue, the men and women were not allowed to sit together. However, many traditional synagogues were starting to liberalize and loosen some of these restrictions, and the Keene Synagogue was no exception. The congregation voted to end separate seating, and Harry could not tolerate that. He left the synagogue and he joined an Orthodox congregation elsewhere, the synagogue that he founded and was the third president of. Harry's children, including my father, felt that if they continued to attend in Keene, that would be a sign of disrespect. And so they went to other synagogues as well. They left Keene. My mother and father joined the synagogue in Gardner, where the abbots were members, and incidentally, where men and women sit together. My mother would have none of this separation business. I became a bar mitzvah in October of 1966 at the age of 13, and that occurred in Gardner. A good number of our Jaffrey friends attended the service and reception. And we'll talk about some people in a minute. For several preceding years, in preparation for my bar mitzvah, my mother would pick me up early from school in Jaffrey, drive me to Hebrew school in Gardner, several afternoons a week. I developed a new set of friends in my Hebrew school class, friends who were, for the first time in my life, Jewish. I am told that our species is pre-programmed, if you will, to coexist in groups. Each of us wants to belong to a group of some kind. It might be a religious group, it might be a quilting group, it could be any group that provides a sense of belonging. Looking back on it, as I approached my teens, I think I struggled a little bit to figure out where my group was. My parents were quite friendly. Well, let me stop right here and talk about some of the folks in here, because some of you may remember them. So here we have a group of some of the people from Jaffrey who were there. In the middle of the table are Homer and Frances Forsher. Homer was the postmaster in town. Homer and Frances were very good friends of my parents. And this is Howard Williams on the left, and his wife Jean, who was my piano teacher and a very good friend of my mother. They lived on Oak Street. This is Abby Brown. She was my 5th grade teacher. She was a hot ticket, and her husband. And these two gentlemen, these were several of the brothers from the seminary who attended my bar mitzvah. They were great. They were great guys. This guy used to have really wonderful debates with my father because he was born in Brooklyn, New York, as a Jew and converted to Catholicism. And then let's flip to maybe the next bar mitzvah. There we are, the head table. The head table is a chubby kid in the middle. That's Steve Krause. That is Steve Krause. This is Jim Forsher, Forsher's son, Mark King. That's Steve Van Eyck, Lynn Lambert, Lynn and Rick Lambert. That's Lynn's younger brother, Steve. They lived in the house right in back of this building where Mark and Sharon Teeger live now, and who were pretty good friends. This guy right here is Ari. The rest of the guys are Gardner guys. This is Ari Freilich. Ari was the son of the rabbi and Rebbe's. Ari's older sister, Hadassah, is married to former Senator Joe Lieber of Connecticut, who ran for vice president of the United States and had an unsuccessful presidential campaign as well. Very distinguished head table. My parents were quite friendly with Reverend and Mrs. Sestaro at the time of the United Church. Some of you may remember the Sestaros, lovely people. They would come to dinner, they would go out to dinner with my folks a lot. In the spring of 1967, Reverend Sestaro approached my parents about whether it would be possible for us to host a mock Passover Seder at our home for his religious school class. My parents were enthusiastic, and I was too. I was going to be able to share some of my Jewish world with my non-Jewish friends. I was a little kind of bummed that my Catholic friends weren't going to be part of this mock Seder, but it was okay. And if we flip ahead, you'll see we made the headlines in the Ledger. There's Reverend Sestaro at the far end, and there we are. And Fritz Weatherby took this picture and wrote this text. He was a reporter for the Ledger in 1967, back in those days, and lived here in Jaffrey. Breaking news. Not long after that, I was, however, the victim of an experience that I must admit was probably the most unpleasant I recall involving my growing up years. It occurred in social studies class. We had a teacher, a very expressive fellow. At this point, I'm in the 9th grade. He was a very expressive fellow. He had an outgoing personality. He was a good teacher. He was interesting. I enjoyed his class. But one day, he was going up in class. He asked us to each divulge our ethnicity or religion. He went up and down the rows in the classroom. And it was a pretty homogeneous group. You were either French Canadian, or you were Irish, Catholic, or Protestant, or maybe you were an English Protestant or something, until he got to me. And I said, I'm Jewish. And his response was immediate. He lurched forward from his desk, and I was sitting near the front of the room. He lurched forward and he said, "You're a Hebrew?" Pretty much like that, except maybe even more demonstrative. Well, I had never really thought about myself as a Hebrew, so I really didn't know the answer. What's this? I remember in Hebrew school, they taught us that there were these Hebrew people that lived a couple of thousand years ago. And I wasn't quite sure how to answer. So, but I figured, well, maybe I'm a descendant of these people, but does that really make me a Hebrew? I said, well, maybe I'm Jewish. I wanted to make sure he understood my answer, a second time. I said, I'm Jewish. He summoned me to the front of the room. He got up, he said, come up here. Came up to the front of the room. He put his hands on my shoulders. He turned me around to face the class. And he spoke to the class about the historical persecution suffered by the Jewish people over history. Now that would have been a topic that is legitimate and good topic to learn in a social studies class. But I didn't have to be displayed up there, did I? After all, today, in New Hampshire, Holocaust education is a mandated subject in our public schools. A good thing. But why was I up there? And then he paraphrased the Shylock monologue from The Merchant of Venice and pointed out in some detail how I was anatomically just like all of the rest of the people in my class. Well, I have to tell you, I never felt more different than I felt at that moment. His intentions, I'm sure, were good, but here again, there was no playbook yet for how to teach this stuff, and he was winging it. My parents sensed that a change might be beneficial for me, and the following fall enrolled me in boarding school. My growing up in Jaffrey had now ended, I thought, but I was wrong. Fast forward. During my first year of law school, my father called me one day. He was now the chair of the Jaffrey Planning Board, and he told me that the Planning Board had approved the application of a young attorney by the name of David Tower to open a law office. Where? In the home he had just purchased from Mr. and Mrs. Hackler on Main Street. My father suggested I call him and see if he might give me a summer job or an internship. I did that. I came home one weekend, I met Dave, we had a cup of coffee. Where? In the Abbott building, which was at that point a restaurant that Bob Van Dyke was at that time. We hit it off. Following my graduation from law school, Dave offered me a job as an associate in his office, and I took up the offer. I passed the bar exam on my first try, and I entered the practice of law in my hometown as an attorney in the building where I had lived during the first 6 years of my life. I didn't know how long I would stay, but I figured it would be good training, even if only on a short-term basis. However, it quickly became apparent to me that the people of this community, many of whom remembered me from my youth, were happy to see me return to Jaffrey. I was warmly welcomed. 1 year became 2, and 2 suddenly became 40. I will tell you that I experienced the warmest of feelings throughout the year when I am greeted by my Jaffrey friends, by my many Jaffrey friends who wish me Happy Hanukkah, Jeff. Happy Passover, Jeff. Happy Jewish New Year, Jeff. What's the name of that holiday again? And I enjoy wishing my friends Merry Christmas, Blessed Easter. The community that welcomed my parents with open arms in 1950 did the same for me in 1979 and in all the years since. Now, my growing up experience in Jaffrey was complete. And I must say that without equivocation, I am honored and humbled to have had the privilege of serving this community all that time. Although many things have changed over the years, the most important things have remained the same as they were when my parents arrived in this warm and welcoming town. And then, Sean, can you go to the last slide? Yeah. So this is how it is today. Well, when our daughter was in high school, 15 years ago, something like that. Hanukkah covered. Again, making news. I'm making so much news in the legend. But there's my daughter on the 8th night of Hanukkah. And of course, if you do something in the Crocker house, we tend to overdo it. So we have 8 in the, not just 8 candles in one menorah. We've got 8 candles in 8 menorahs. And we would do this every year. And groups of her friends, some Jewish, some not Jewish, would come over and share the holiday. And I would stand by making sure I knew where the fire extinguisher was located. Just a brief postscript, if I may. In recent years, our community has witnessed some acts of hate speech, graffiti using hate symbols, and bigotry. They are a product of the times in which we live and the growing anti-Semitism and intolerance that exists in our society. These incidents do not represent this community. I believe they're the result of ignorance, usually on the part of some young people who really have no idea about what these hateful symbols mean and the history behind them. Unfortunately, we are living in a time when our society is being afflicted by very dark forces. Now more than ever, we, and by we, I mean all of us, our community leaders, our clergy, our government leaders, need to stand up and speak out against anti-Semitism, radical ideology, racism, white supremacy, intolerance, bigotry, and hate speech directed against any group. Back in 1950, Jaffrey set a shining example of how a good and tolerant community welcomes newcomers. And Jaffrey, my beloved hometown, continues to do just that.
Well, I hadn't realized that the Crocker family kept a kosher home, and it occurs to me that they would not have approved of their daughter-in-law indicting a ham sandwich. Okay, let's begin. Who would like to ask the first question in the house? And don't be shy and just tell us to whom you're going to direct the question. Yes, please stand up. Who is this question for?
Well, it's not really a question, it's just a reminiscence, if you don't mind.
A reminiscence?
Yes.
Well, we're looking for questions
All right, I'll sit down, but when you're ready for reminiscence.
for the speakers, but if you would, no, sir. If you want to give us a little reminiscence, please do.
My name is Harvey Sawyer, and I've got memories of growing up a little before you. I didn't know you as a young.
Harvey, why don't you go over here?
But I grew up delivering milk around town, as you probably know, with my dad, Alfred Sawyer. And one of our regular stops was at your father's place of business. And I don't remember, I think he bought something once in a while, maybe a cream or milk. I don't remember that, but it was always a stop there. And my father was a great horse trader. And one of the first memories I have is I got my first bicycle from your dad's stuff. It was $2. It was a girl's bike, and it was rusty. But my dad bought me that bicycle and provided me with a little electric drill with a wire brush on the end of it and a pint of red paint. and he put me to work. That was one of my first memories of going to Joe Crocker's. But we were there, it seemed like it was regularly, several times a week, I'm sure. And then one of the last memories is a fond memory of your dad in later life. I collected a pile of batteries. We recycled, and we said we had a iron pile and a brass pile, and we said batteries. Well, I was an adult by this time, and I had saved a pile of 10 or 12 batteries. And I don't know how I contacted your dad, but he came down to pick up the batteries. And he was not happy because some of them were kind of small. It was so much, 25 cents a battery or something, but they came out of airplanes and by necessity they're small. But anyway, he agreed to buy the batteries and the total sale was $2, which coincidentally I think is the same as the price of the bicycle years and years before. So he was getting elderly and he was a little shaky, and he had me fill in the check for him, and then he signed it. And I always wished I'd saved that check. What a memento that would have been to have had. And I want to say thank you I want to thank Martha too. I got to know both of you a lot better tonight, and I've often wondered about the story of your folks in Jaffrey. And when I see programs on television about the Jewish history and the various religions, I grew up with cousins who were Catholic and I was Protestant, and there was all this headbutting and stuff. But Sam Hackler was one of my classmates. Anyway, I want to say thank you very much to both of you, and that was a nice presentation. You did exceed the bar. Nicely done. Thank you.
Okay, if you are online and would like to unmute and raise your hand or just speak, because I don't see all your pictures. Yes.
It's going to be hard
for you. Please unmute yourself. I see you raising your hand. Unmute yourself. I don't see all your names. And just whoever speaks first.
Yes, I have a very fond memory of Joe Crocker because I worked in Godin's 5 and 10 all of my high school years. And Joe would come in on a very regular basis, and he would buy something to bring home to his little boy. And it could be a candy bar, could be a toy, could be something. And I remember thinking to myself, boy, that kid's gonna grow up to be a spoiled brat. But he didn't. And he's my lawyer, and he's a wonderful, wonderful lawyer, but he's a wonderful person. He's just so human, just so thoughtful and kind. And I'm so happy that I knew his dad, and his dad was a regular customer of mine, right all through the years at the farm stand. I have very good memories of your dad. And some of your mom, because when we delivered milk there and the holiday was coming, we had to have a brand new milk bottle. And I can remember being sent to the storage place and opening a cardboard box to get out new milk bottles for Esther. Those are my memories. Thank you.
Well, it strikes me that, Martha, you're at a disadvantage because you're in Jaffrey and it's like old home week. I don't know that we have anyone from Gorham online, but questions from the audience. Yes, please stand up. Who are you asking?
I'd like to ask a question to Jeff. I noticed on the slide the naturalization papers here, grandfather, I think it was that. It was Joseph. Was that common to use the middle name and the first name as the same?
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, that was on my father's naturalization papers. So, the records, weren't good back in Russia. And, the date of birth, even on those papers, they just picked December 26th as his date of birth because it was the day after a holiday, right? And the same thing happened with his middle name. He didn't really have a middle name, right? So he had a Yiddish name when he came here that was Americanized. Yeah, and so at some point along the line, he felt like, well, I think I need to have a middle name. So he just gave himself, he wasn't very, I mean, he just kind of, winged it. So used the same name twice.
Tomorrow is 75 years to the day after your father was naturalized, 75 years. And if you talk to Jews, and not just Jews, it's true of others as well, my name isn't actually Steinfield, but that's another story. It is, but my grandfather wasn't Steinfield. So they changed it. I don't know why they didn't pick Crocker. Questions online? Yeah, can we see the full?
Yep. So there's one from, do you want to read it out? This one from Jack Calhoun.
Well,
There's a question over there, or do you want to see the whole group?
let's see the whole group.
Okay, there you go.
Jack Calhoun
Yeah, he's
grew up in Gilsum with a foreign mother and a New England father. He went to UNH, and his roommate and dear friend was the son of Russian Jews from Princeton, New Jersey. I love your story about having Gentile friends in Jaffrey. It brought back wonderful memories of what it was like for me to have such a wonderful Jewish friend. Very nice. Okay, online, raise your hand, anybody? Judge Ginsburg? No, okay. I'm looking to see if anyone, I'm going to ask a question, if I may, of Martha. Would you? And it has to do with being a prosecutor and then becoming a judge. As a judge, how were you affected by the fact that you had been a prosecutor? Did you bend over backwards in either direction? Judges try to stay neutral, of course, but I'm interested in how that influenced you as a judge.
Well, in many aspects, the ethical obligations of a prosecutor are not all that different from the ethical obligations of a judge. It's, as a prosecutor, you're not the police. You're not the attorney for the police. You're the attorney for the people. And your job as a prosecutor is to ensure that justice is done. You don't care whether it's a conviction, you don't care whether it's a loss, but has justice been obtained to the best of your ability? And that's the same thing you do as a judge. It's easier being a lawyer than it is a judge because you have one client and your goal for that client is to achieve your client's goal. Whereas everything you do as a judge is a balancing act. You have to weigh everything. You have to determine what is the best alternative. And of course, district court really lent itself to that. What can I do? And most, I have to say that the average age of people that came to me were mostly in that, pre-25 age, lack of brain completion. But, the goal was, what can I do to help ensure that this person doesn't come back? And that led to some pretty interesting sentencing. I can think of one that kind of goes in with Jeff's speech. I had some couple of kids who burn Schwartz stickers into the pavement of a road. Again, what were they thinking? And so their sentence, they came in, parents, brought them in by the ear. And their sentence was to read Elie Wiesel's Night and do a book report on it. And tell me what you learned from it. At which point in time, we had no idea, we had no idea, we had no idea. That was an appropriate sentence for the events. So it's
Very good.
Well, we've just seen the combination of our two speakers' subjects. And I'm glad I asked you that question, Mark. That's a very telling story. And if only judges were as creative in all cases, these young people would be better off, and so would the rest of us. Now, if I'm not getting any more questions or comments, I want to thank Jeff Crocker and Martha Crocker for, I'll say it again, spellbinding presentations. Now, next month, I'm having a memory. Lisa. Boston, thank you, dear. Lisa Boston, many of us know her from Peterborough Players. She will be our speaker on March 4. It will be a very different kind of presentation. As you may know, Lisa lives here in Jaffrey, but has performed all over the place, all over the country. And it will be very interesting to hear stories from the theater. So I invite you all to come, same time, Friday, March 4th. Thanks again.